Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the General Eclectic podcast. I'm your host, Kale Zelden, and Rod is currently gallivanting around Italy in promotion for Live Not by Lies. So one more time, folks, if you have not picked up Rod's Live Not by Lies book, you should do so. And as I said last episode, I really think you should pick up the Benedict option too, because I think the two books work together, and it really, in certain respects, has become more pressing and relevant. But at any rate, we're here for episode number 32, and I decided to bring with me to the podcast today my older brother, Mark Zelden. Mark, how you doing today?
Doing well, Kale. Thanks for having me.
No, indeed. So Mark is a long time sort of DC guy. He's been working in and out. I think you started on the House side in 1990 as an intern, and have really done a variety of different things in and around DC, from consulting to lobbying to even working in administrations. So we thought it might be a great opportunity to sort of talk a little bit about something you don't hear much about, which is, we hear lots about Trump. We hear lots about, the tweets and all of this sort of thing. But I thought it would be important for our viewers to sort of get an inside view of what was going on in the administration. So, Mark, why don't you start us off? How did you get involved with the Trump thing in the first place?
Yeah, it's an interesting story. The day before the 2016 presidential election, Dean and I were actually in London. I was there on business. I was working for a transport shipping company in New Orleans, where we're from, right, called CRC Global Solutions.
Yeah.
There was a conference there in London on London Metal Exchange for some things the company did. We made a long weekend, and we were flying back the day before. I was dreading the election. I thought Hillary was going to win. I think I was probably in the 90th percentile on that. But I was
right there with you. I had no sense that
no expectations, right?
Win,
yeah. and no connections to the Trump campaign as such. I mean, I certainly wanted him to win. I did not want Hillary to be president. That should be obvious. Although I did struggle with my personal vote being in Louisiana for a time, but ultimately I came around to vote. But election night happened. Dina, my wife, who you know well, made me watch the results. I didn't want to, and
I went to sleep. Literally, I went to sleep at like 7 o'clock that night. I was just like, I was pre-depressed or something.
If it was up to me, I would have done that. But she, put me there, and we're sipping wine. And when I was on Twitter at the time, and there were people that are real number crunchers and gurus, and they were saying pretty early on in these key states. So we stayed up and watched everything over, at 3 a.m. or whatever it was, just sort of surreal, just blown away by the whole thing.
Yeah.
Well, the next day, I did have some friends, longtime friends that I had known from my years in Washington. It does go back off and on for 30 years, or now for 30 years. And I just congratulated them. I knew they were going to be in a good spot.
Sure.
One ended up being the head of Ledge Affairs for the president, chair the transition. Others were in other senior spots at the Treasury Department and others. So I just congratulated them the next day. Well, they actually got back to me later in the day, one of them especially, and said, Mark, have you thought about coming up to Washington, work on the transition?
Right, because you guys were living in New Orleans at the time.
Yes, yeah, I was working for a private company in distribution, and did international things, and had no. So I told him, I said no.
Yeah.
And when I said no, I said not no, I don't want to do it, but no, I really hadn't any thought of it. The thought just had never occurred to me. So he said, well, look, don't close the door. We'll get back to Thanksgiving. Why don't you talk to your family about it? So I did talk to Dean about it, my wife now for 28 years, and she was like, oh, you got to do it. And I said, really? She said, well, yeah, well, think about it. You're never going to have friends like this in a transition in a new Republican administration ever again.
Yeah.
And she was right. I mean, the guy that I was chatting with chaired the transition, became head of Ledge Affairs. Other people, which I don't need to get in all, but I definitely had some people at high levels of the thing. So I was a little bit taken aback by that. So prayed about it. And she says, why don't you go ask the owner of the company? Who's not especially political, although he did lean in Trump's direction, and to see what he says. And he said, well, sure, Mark, I'll give you a 6-week paid leave. And I thought, wow, okay, well, and then I've got friends, as you know, up here, and guys offered to let me stay at their place, private bath and private bedroom. So I thought, okay. And I remember getting on the plane on January the 2nd, 2017. That was when I came up for the transition. And I told Dean, I said, I may not be coming back for a while.
Right.
And she says, well, what do you mean? And I said, well, there's a lot of people at my level of experience in Washington and my relationships and the processes and the things that I do who didn't support the president, either openly opposed him or just didn't support him, or for whatever reasons didn't want to go work in the administration.
Okay, so I want to jump in right here, because I think this is an important thing, something that you have reminded me of from time to time. Part of the particular challenges of this transition is that while Trump clearly and unequivocally won the Republican nomination, this was not a normal process or a given process, as everybody in our audience knows, right? I mean, it was basically it was an end around from what I think you would call the Republican establishment. I think this is nothing groundbreaking here. So if I could just ask you a little bit, I mean, where were you in all of that, prior to it? Like, where were you in terms of, your headspace? I mean, because nothing has divided a sort of political party in quite the way that Trump did. And again, as an illustration, look at what happened this past cycle with the Democrats. I had a load of candidates, and in some sort of snap to moment, they all, and I used to have this date written down in my notes here, they all said, okay, it's Joe's turn now, right? So where were you, sort of, just as someone who's been part of sort of conservative Republican politics for a really long time?
Well, I'll say this: President Trump was like a conventional Republican in a lot of ways, right? Taxes, judges, those sorts of things. But he was quite different, I think, on some, and he talked about pro-life and pro-guns and things of that sort. Although we were certainly suspicious about his pro-life credentials, although that turned out to be shockingly good. But he was very different than the sort of Washington consensus and the DC Republicans on some very big things. China. Policy towards China being one of them, immigration policy writ large, which was sort of an expansionist viewpoint in Washington, and then trade agreements, where genuine reciprocity was kind of shunted aside. Now China's always is related to all these, right? But where reciprocity was sort of put on the side, and we didn't necessarily have to be treated, one for one. Other countries could get 2-to-1 or 3-to-1 or 4-to-1, and the sort of free trade is defined by just lowering tariff barriers for others, but us not necessarily having access, to in these other ways. He was quite different on that. And I do remember the NAFTA debate. There's an interesting little nugget. NAFTA was something that was a big deal when I was a young person in Washington. And it was sort of like Bill Clinton told the unions and Newt Gingrich told sort of the Buchanan types, look, we're going to do this one thing. We're going to do this free trade agreement. And then they did it. And I was too young to really pay attention. But I generally supported free trade as it was defined by the Washington political class. It wasn't until 2015 when Trump came along that he really got me and others to really be thinking about it. Like, is NAFTA something that I'm going to follow my sword over? Was it really fair to U.S. producers compared to Mexico and Canada? I mean, should that just go on in perpetuity? Is that really a dogmatic thing that this one candidate is saying and all the other ones aren't? But it so offends my political viewpoints, and the reality is no. And it is interesting. I'll give you a nugget in a second that I think you're going to find interesting about my own personal transformation that the president had influenced me on. Oh, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I mean, I think this is one of the sort of the NAFTA. I remember the NAFTA moment back in the day, but like you, oh, well, free trade's good. I just didn't, I really didn't, I didn't really think much of it, but, clearly it has had a negative effect in the middle of the country, right? I mean, this is, the NAFTA, whatever was intended on it. One of the consequences of it has been to well, it made rich people richer, clearly, and it really
Yes.
burrowed out the manufacturing class and the middle class of
Yes.
large
You
swaths of
know,
the country.
no doubt. And of course, where we come from in South Louisiana, we don't have that same kind of unionized manufacturing base. We do have some shipbuilding, but it didn't necessarily affect our communities in that kind of a way.
Right.
And we're actually are an exporting state with the Mississippi River and the port. So if
Yeah.
anything else, we on the margins at least probably were more beneficial than
Right.
not.
Right.
But yeah, I hadn't really given it much thought. But I'll tell you, it was the spring of 2016. I was working for CRC.
Right.
One of the customers that we had was a company in Louisiana that has growing rice. It's a variant of some sort of a genetic resistant strain of rice that's hardy and is able to be shipped to the Pacific Rim in China. Amongst other things, they do
Right.
a number, but this is a company that ships it. My former employer was a distributor for them.
Right.
So we're talking to the gentleman. He's of Chinese ancestry, but he's spoke English like he was from New Orleans. He actually went to Fort Chae with our Uncle Scott.
Oh, that's funny.
So, and I had Sam with me, my younger son, just so the audience knows, my younger son and Kale's nephew is a fluent Mandarin speaker. So we thought, let's have Sam come in case we had to have some conversations, because we were talking to some people overseas in China about a couple of things that we were doing. So before the conversation started, the gentleman mentioned, we were just talking a little bit about presidential politics and the banter. And he asked me about Trump. And I didn't say much at the time. I wasn't supporting the president as a candidate. I was supporting other people at the time.
Yeah.
And he said, well, Mark, this is the first time in 20 years that I've been able to export some of this high quality Louisiana rice to China, the Pacific Rim, but especially China.
Yeah.
And I looked at him and I was just kind of surprised. I said, really? Well, what's going on? He's like, no, the Chinese take Trump very seriously.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I thought, but he's not even the nominee yet. He's just but he is changing he is setting the terms for the debate. And the smart money Chinese, communist business power brokers are thinking he's got a good chance to win and are responding likewise. And I thought,
pretty amazing.
Wow, it really made me think a lot about China and these issues in general. So I thought that would be just a good nugget. I think there are other people like me, our class of people and our terms of experience who had similar type, maybe not the exact same moment, but similar, something transpired over the course of 2016 to make people like me think, well, is that in the best interest of the country? Maybe it's not, and I had not really thought about it until Trump became a candidate, at least not in any meaningful sense.
All right. So Trump was clearly doing some different things, and your relationship to the campaign was non-existent, but whatever, so it comes down to between Trump and Hillary, and you're going to vote for Trump, even though your vote, Trump's going to win Louisiana. That was never sort of up for grabs, so to speak. All right, so he wins, and so you elect to be, all right, look, you get called, you get the call to sort of be part of the transition team, and so you're like, well, sweet, why not? I mean, this is a great opportunity. It looks like your company is going to sort of let you do this thing, so you go and you do it. And what happened that surprised you in this whole transition business? Because I do think it's important to the idea here that Trump was a failed president in terms of he wasn't able to sort of get anything done. I want you to talk a little bit about that.
No, we'll get there are some things to be critical of the president over. We'll get into that, I think, through the course of this conversation. But for every one of those, there'll be 10 successes in my book. What surprised me was, I did get to reconnect with people that I had not seen in 10 years or more. So there were some people with my, I sort of straddle the sort of ideologically motivated on one shoe and the sort of establishment being in Washington on the other shoe. So I did there were people that I saw that I was pleased that were part of it, and that was a good thing, right? What's interesting about a transition, Kale, is it's in the old GSA building, which is just a couple of blocks from the White House. And there's really only one way in, and there's Secret Service, and you get a badge, and there's only about 300 or 400 people total. At least that's
400. Is that what you said?
It was about 400, right?
Yeah,
And
okay. All right,
I'm sure they're structured differently, but ours was, there were issue areas, there were specific departments. And what was really cool about it was everybody was all within 3 or 4 floors, right? So you could, you'd have these policy meetings and you do budget meetings. And what I was part of was the budget.
Right.
Every incoming administration does what's called a transition budget, which ultimately comes there. The budget typically is submitted by a president in February of each year, right? But because a new president usually takes a little bit longer. Yeah. So I got to be part of that. But like, for example, you'd be in the elevator and it would just be like me and General Mattis, and he had 1 aide. Right. Right. Or me and Ben Carson, or like riding the elevator. Like, and there's just not a lot of staff and all that. But there's
not a lot of like clutter or in betweens. It's just, it's a stripped down reality. Yeah.
There's no layers. I remember some of the intelligence, and there was an intelligence group, right? CIA and NSA, and I remember there was some hullabaloo going on.
Interesting.
I was just focused on doing what I was supposed to do and interacting, but I think the big surprise was that it was really, really small.
Okay.
And that you could interact with everyone.
Mm-hmm. So, all right.
I guess I thought there were more layers, right?
Yeah. All right. So, but again, I mean, the uniqueness of this Trump moment. I would imagine, for instance, I think the last Republican president was W, right?
Yes.
I would imagine that when W, well, actually, it probably was also strange because of the recount and all that sort of stuff. But
it was probably.
But in terms of staffing out and working in the transition, I can't imagine that they had a ton of issues filling out these, I would imagine, coveted positions in any kind of transition. But it was a little bit different here with Trump's situation, right?
Yeah. I mean, look, I know a lot more now, so in the future, if I'm part of a transition, things will make a lot more sense to me. Yeah. But no, you'd be surprised. I mean, it was a couple of things still kind of stand out to me from that time. One is just how many people, again, of my experience level and my level and the position of being an agency head within a department type like I am, and what's called an SES, Senior Executive Service, a lot of those people were very publicly critical of the president as a candidate.
Right.
And I'll get into an example in a second about the dysfunction of the department that I ultimately got into and some examples of that.
Yeah, that's good.
But yes, that there was a smaller pool of people who initially wanted to go in. And one thing that I want to add to this was the pressure was already intense in Washington. And I don't just mean the Washington Post, the New York Times, and the cable news and the big networks, but people were protesting outside the building. Yeah, I mean, there was this intense. You were feeling it if you were part of if you're part of the DC club. Yeah, there were covert and overt things going on that would make you feel like maybe I shouldn't go. Maybe this isn't a good idea.
Yeah, is this a prudent move on my part as an adult man? Yeah.
Yes, and once the whole Russia thing, which happened the second week, I think, of January.
Correct. Yeah,
I can't underemphasize, once that started in January of 2017 and technically ended in, I think, March of 2019. It dominated the landscape. It sucked oxygen out that any conventional administration wouldn't have been able to get half as many things done. I think it had a chilling effect on people of my experience from going into the administration. I also think it convinced 40 or 50 House Republicans in 2018 not to run for re-election. People actually believe that stuff.
Right.
Now, I'm going to give you an example in a minute about when, because I still believe that stuff too. Yeah. Even though I went to the transition, I was still reading sources of information and still sort of wondering,
what is this thing?
Is this legit or not? There was a specific moment in March of 2017 that I'll get into in a minute. But I think the pressures that we were feeling were intense. What was interesting for me was I was a little bit different than a lot of the people that were coming in on the transition that were not on the campaign. Right. There were people on the campaign. That's different. But there was 2 types of political appointees. One is somebody that was living and working in the Washington, D.C. area at the time of the 2016 election and then came in the administration. That's one type. And then another type was people like me, who I was living in New Orleans at the time, in Louisiana, and I decided to come up. Now, I do have experience prior, of course, a lot of experience, but it was a real difference I noticed very quickly amongst those people who were coming up, moving up and changing their lives and going up. There was a real, more of a loyalty and more of a support for the administration, and a little bit of an impervious shield towards the DC swamp media and this sort of 24/7 intense hatred.
Right.
You know, I was said the hateful things that were told to me and my wife at the inauguration while we were in line. I've never experienced such things of that sort. So in our world, in our upper middle class, you know, white collar world, those things have an effect. And it definitely had an effect on the administration, the number of people that were coming in with commensurate experience and the caliber of people that were coming in.
Right. So, you know, so you say this has, you know, this, I would assume this absorbs so much of the attention of an administration, you know, because, you know, it came to nothing, of course, but, you know, you still have to deal with it. Right. I mean, so how do you, you know, so what is it like to kind of deal with all of that while you're actually trying to put together a transition and you're actually trying to deal with issues? You know, I know, you know, you eventually found your way into the Department of Labor, you know, but so what we can keep it there, you know, how did that affect, you know, your work in the Department of Labor?
Oh, well, intensely. You know, the resistance movement, you know, and it's impressive, you know, and I say that kind of in a Machiavellian sense. I mean, the day after the president's inauguration, I'm walking to the Labor Department in a sea of 100,000 violently angry, mostly white women with pink pussy hats. It was scary because there's no way that that's legitimate. That's genuine. It's ginned up, you know, that kind of anger and hatred or just animosity takes a whole year probably to actually build up. But I felt that, you know, right away, what the Democrats did a very good, and I say this good in quotes, you know, effective job was unprecedented opposition by the Senate minority at the time, Democrats, blocking everything. I mean, I'm forcing votes on things that had never, you know, we'd never had votes before for the Deputy Secretary of Labor, right? Like, in other words, typically that person, once they went through the committee process, the vetting was traditionally done at the committee level, right? And if the committee decided to forward a nominee out, even if it was on a party line vote, that did happen a lot during the W and Obama years, especially. You didn't force a cloture vote, which could require up to 30 hours of floor time, which is basically 3 days on the Senate, I guess, depending on the, you know, maybe two days, and then an actual roll call vote. You know, that was unprecedented. But also for the Labor Department, the original person that was assigned to be the designee was a gentleman by the name of Andy Puzder. Andy Puzder would have been an outstanding Secretary of Labor once I got in the department and learned how it worked and what issues it were. His background and his resume were tailor-made for that department. But they were able to sandbag him and harpoon his nomination. They actually got Murkowski and Collins from Maine to vote no in committee, or at least Collins, I think, was going to vote no in committee. It's amazing. They'll vote for these radically left-wing Biden nominees, but wouldn't vote for Buzzer. But that's all. But so that was in February of 2017. So we have no secretary. Usually all the secretaries are confirmed within the first day or certainly the first week, you know. And so here we are in the middle of February, no nominee. He stands down. Well, the next day, the White House appointed a designee by the gentleman by the name of Alexander Acosta the next day. But he didn't actually get confirmed and come into the department until almost the beginning of May. I mean, it was brilliant from their standpoint. It just crippled us. We that department, right? We had about 15 or 20 political appointees where we're supposed to have about 120. You know, you really just aren't doing anything. You're just sort of on an autopilot until the person.
So it's basically mucking up the works, right? Well, you know what's interesting to me, Mark, is I've not been much of a sort of a political horse race guy. I'm interested in politics, obviously. You know, you and I have had our conversations for 35 years about these kinds of things. what is interesting to me is in our lifetimes we have witnessed the degeneration. Look, everybody on the left and on the right now, as they look at the realities of life in 2021, point correctly to the problems of polarization. We can really see the polarization, but it is absolutely ludicrous in my way of thinking to suggest that the polarization has been created by Trump. So okay, and I'll stake that. I truly believe that. I don't think that Trump always, of course, handled it well, and I think that he had some fun, perhaps, with sort of playing with it. But to suggest that Trump is the cause rather than something else is really silly.
That's
I look at the polarization. I mean, it is a long 35-year game here that we find ourselves in 2021 at this place of absurd polarization. Specifically in Washington D.C.
Yeah.
How do you see that story?
Well, I've got plenty of thoughts and experience on that. There's a number of different things that aren't necessarily in an order, although if I put them on a piece of paper, good. A couple of things. First of all, I would say that the H.W. Bush's administration's Justice Department locking arms with the NAACP and other groups and the quote civil rights
88, 89, is that what we're talking about? No,
this would have been after the 1990 census.
Okay.
And drawing congressional districts, like for example, if like when we were growing up, there were more than enough persons of African ancestry, Black and Creole, to draw a congressional district that was centered around New Orleans, that had enough minority voters in it to be legitimate in the sense that it's relatively compact, relatively similar interests and things of that sort. But then, and for those in the audience who will be listening, they ended up, taking that and extrapolating it to drawing a district, that went from Baton Rouge up the Mississippi Delta all the way over to Shreveport.
Right. And again, for those of us in the audience who don't aren't familiar with Louisiana geography, this is a reality that scales to all the other states as well.
Yes.
Right. And if you look, Google, what is the name of that district, Mark? What is the number?
It was the 4th congressional district in 1992 election.
So, if you look at this on a map, it's hilarious. I mean, it's absurd. And, and if you're listening to a political pundit, yammer on about gerrymandering as if it's something that's been, sort of, created by, nasty Republicans in, 20,
since the 2010 election.
It's laughable, right? So you go and you see this. And so that clearly not only was that problematic in terms of, these strangely geographical districts, but also I think it inserts into the body politic a kind of cynicism, don't you think?
Yes. Oh, there's no doubt. There's no doubt that's true. But even just from the practical standpoint, you've got, like, I think our home state is a good example. We've got 6 congressional districts.
Right. 1
congressional district is overwhelmingly Black, African American. Mm-hmm. The other 5 are overwhelmingly white. Whites in Louisiana, certainly in the last decade or plus, are probably 75% Republican. Black voters historically are somewhere in 90%, although Trump did pretty well in 2020 in Louisiana. So I think what that did, you have members of Congress who are not really representing ideologically, they really don't have any ideological diversity in their district. Now that cuts both ways, right?
Right, of course, he does, and I think you're fair about that.
Right, so that's one thing. I would say race-oriented districts is the explosion of that after the 1990 census is one. Sort of the reinterpretation of the Voting Rights Act as amended is one. I'd say 2, which is very underrated, is something that Newt Gingrich and the Republican Congress did in 1995 when I was a young aide for the chairman of the Appropriations Committee at the time, Bob Livingston. And that was this, and there are many things about the contract with America that I supported then and I support now. And I think most conservatives and Republicans did then and do now. But one thing that was really bad, I think, it really doesn't have anything to do with policy. It had to do with this idea that because of the deregulation of airlines and the ability to fly much less expensively than it was, say, when we were kids in the 70s.
Oh, yeah.
It was like,
Mark, you and I didn't get on a plane until 1982.
Yeah,
I'm pretty sure we took a plane our first time we went to Disneyland.
Yeah,
just right. Disney World. Sorry, Disney World.
No, I actually went on a plane with Dad in the mid 70s to get Aunt Penny. So leave that aside.
Yeah.
We went to help move her down from Columbus, Ohio after she got her PhD.
Right.
But one of the big things that news says, no, you should fly back home every week. Right. So Bob Livingston, who I had worked for, who had been in the House, he got elected in 1977. He had moved up to Washington with his wife and his kids, which was a much more common thing at the time. Until the 70s, really, the Congress really adjourned in August for the August recess, and they wouldn't necessarily come back unless there was a war or some special. Sure. So they would come in the spring and they would end right at the, in August.
Yeah.
With people going back and forth every weekend, the thought was, well, you'll stay in touch with your district.
Right.
And I don't think that's true. I think history's shown that that's not true.
Yeah.
People are going back and forth now, and they're still going to the swamp. Right?
Yeah. Right.
As I see it. But what it did was it prevented the sort of being here for weeks at a time, even months at a time, families getting to know each other, spending time with one another, even if it may be people are both Presbyterian, so their wives, their family go to the same church or something like that. And you build those relationships so that whatever political differences you have being a Republican or a Democrat, you've built some social capital or some family ties in that sense. And I think that has been catastrophic, in my opinion, having people going back and forth, coupled with the fact that the sessions never end, right?
In terms of
you're talking, and it doesn't end.
Right. And you're talking about like the culture that sort of surrounds and feeds and gives spirit to the DC thing.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. No, that's good. It's
really
again, it's one of those
underrated.
funny things. You don't think that such a thing would even be who cares, right? But it does have this sort of long-term, slow altering effect upon.
It didn't happen right away. Correct. It took time. Now, I understand what Newt Gingrich and Dick Armey and Tom DeLay and the Republican Congress and what I understand the thought process behind it.
Yeah.
That guys were staying up here and they were getting too chummy with Washington, and this is a way to prevent that. But I think the reality is it's shown that for whatever reasons that's not the case, and really it's hard on families.
Yeah.
And it continues to this day. So I think that's another one. Another one that's in this genre is the congressional gift bans and the travel bans.
Okay, so talk a little bit about this, because this is one of those things that looks really good on a headline, but when you dig into it a little bit, it doesn't do the thing you think it's going to do.
Correct.
Right? So tell me what these bans are and what the effects have been.
Right. So if you remember, there was a senator from New Jersey named Robert Torricelli.
Yes.
And the Torch, as they called him, and he kind of conformed to New Jersey the way that some of our elected officials in Louisiana conform to people's thoughts about Louisiana.
Yeah.
Well, he had accepted like $20,000 furs for a girlfriend and, $5,000 bottles of wine. And, at the same time that the whole Jack Abramoff lobbying scandal was going on, this would have been in 2002, 3, 4, and that kind of range. And so the Congress, when the Democrats took the Congress back after the 2006 elections, took the House back and Senate, and this is a rule of the House, right? It's not a law. Right. But when the new Congress begins in January, every 2 years, there's a rules package that they pass, and it's a lot of stuff that doesn't really matter that much. But in this case, what they did was they banned all gifts, to members and staff, right? All, like you couldn't go get taken out to lunch or any of that stuff.
Right.
Now, if you're not in the middle of it, and I would probably, if I wasn't in the middle of it, I'd have probably these
right. And that certainly was my reaction. I've never been a Hill rat. I've never spent any time. I'd be like, well, why did so okay, go keep going. Sorry.
Yeah, like they're getting $500 dinners and $1,000, blah, blah, blah. They get, people are paying for them to travel all these exotic places.
Yeah.
And some of that's true. I mean, I'm not suggesting that it wasn't true. There was some excesses. Anybody that does an internet search of Jack Abramoff scandals can see some of that. But it doesn't mean that you ban it entirely. And what it really does is a lot of your like junior and entry level type legislative staff or your administrative staff, I was able to build relationships with those people as a young lobbyist and a young congressional staffer, with young congressional staffers, because I could take them to lunch. And the lunch, I guaranteed if we went back and looked at my American Express receipts from the time, $50 to $100 total for me and the other person, right? We're not talking about something getting carried away. I'd have no problem having some sort of a cap, right? Like you can't do it over $200 or $100, whatever, right? Or there's some aggregate cap for the year or something.
Sure.
But what that's had the effect of doing is you just have less interactions, you have less sociability, less personal interactions. And again, like you were saying earlier, it didn't immediately have the impact, but over time you've had less and less interactions. I have a lot of friends and colleagues that I know that are on the Democrat side of the aisle that I made back when I was in my 20s and my 30s from these processes.
That you probably wouldn't have been able, sorry to interrupt, but you probably wouldn't have been able to establish those kinds of relationships had you started, post ban, right?
Yeah, I don't know.
You wouldn't have had those opportunities.
Yeah.
Right. So I think about this a lot, you're whatever, you're in LA, you're a legislative assistant, you're part of a House or a Senate office. And, if you never have interactions with folks in offices on the other side of the aisle, you can very quickly sort of, I'm going to use very sort of academic speak here, but you can very quickly other these people and turn them into sort of like,
very easy
twiddling your mustaches type, caricatures. And you see so much of that in the way that people talk about politics right now, right? If you're on the right, you think that all Democrats are, whatever, terrible. Yeah. And if you're on the right and a Republican, you think that all the Democrats are terrible and cynical and awful. And that's just not really true. I mean, look, you can ultimately make a judgment about a piece of legislation, a framing or whatever it is, say, like, I don't like that. I don't think it's good. That's natural and good and proper. But to sort of automatically just sort of consign like evil, and I think that this really, the distillation point, I think for somebody like me, is that it became encapsulated in the orange man bad meme, right? It's just like, it didn't matter. Trump said it, it's bad. Trump wants it, it's bad. And it's like, guys, we're not dumb people. Yet here we are relying on the dumbest of the dumb heuristic, right? That orange man bad. And it's been a 30-year process. And again,
I'm giving you little examples.
Yeah, go ahead.
I'm giving you little contributory examples of things that, in a cumulative, individually, they're not huge, right? But like cumulatively, they do. I mean, look, I'll give you an example of a trip that I got to take in the late 90s when I was on the Hill that you can't do now. Mm-hmm. And that was the United Mine Workers and the mining industry had a group of Democrats and Republicans went on a trip out west. Mm-hmm. They wanted to show some primarily more Eastern oriented members, just the industry and its importance to the business community, but also workers. And it was sort of, when you get the mine workers and the mine workers union, all right, so you've got, and so I spent, 4 or 5 days with a lot of people, on the other side of the aisle, and some that I still know. Yeah. But again, most of those people, the districts that their members represented at the time, actually had middle and working class people in them. Yeah. Most Democrat districts, and the very few districts in the Democrats represent now in the House, actually it'll be a big city, or it'll have a big city, a part of a big city, university town. You just don't have a lot of like just regular Joe hard hat people. Yeah. Just very middle class, Budweiser drinking,
physical people who live and work physically and in the real spaces. Yes, I have a thought about this later on. I want to talk
actually use their hands. So that's an example of something that I got to experience that our kids' generation won't, at least unless the rules get changed. So I think that's another one. And then I think but the biggest change that I personally experienced was Obama's election to president coming to Washington.
Okay, so talk a little bit about that, because I know you're not like some like hardcore like Obama hater. You obviously you have your differences and whatnot,
I went to his inauguration. Yeah, I went to his first inauguration.
So why would you say such a thing, and how do you make sense out of that? That's a good.
Well, there's one sort of esoteric thing, and then there's one specific thing.
Okay, good, perfect.
And I think the specific thing has just destroyed whatever comity was there at the time, or not entirely, but largely destroyed. The first thing was there was about 20 or 30,000, if we had to do an estimate. It could be more, but it's a sizable number. The District of Columbia's got, I guess, about 700,000 people in it. The metro area is it's big. It's over 3 million.
I mean, that's if you're including like Maryland,
the suburbs,
DC,
right.
suburbs. Okay, gotcha.
Yeah, but the political class, there's a lot of people in the metro area that are only tangentially involved in any meaningful sense about what goes on in Congress to the executive
specifically branch. What goes on in Congress, right? Yeah, totally. Yeah.
So the political class, adding 20 or 30,000 people is a lot, right? And they were mostly younger people. I hesitate to use racial terms, but more often than not, white. Mm-hmm. And there was this real sense that Obama, and it was certainly fed to them by the media and the universities they went to, that Obama was going to be some sort of a transformative president
hey, Mark, we are the people we've all been waiting for. Right, I think it was something. Right. What was the line? I think that was an Obama line,
Yes, we're the people we've been waiting for, or something like that.
You drink that kind of, that's a hell of a drug.
Yes. And look, we'll get into Trump stuff in a bit, but the cult of personality was real. I was here.
Yeah.
And once it was pretty clear that he was just not really that great. I mean, that he was a good candidate at the right time, but he wasn't really a leader. He didn't understand the legislative process. He wasn't willing to muck himself up and do the hard work, a la LBJ on substantive legislation.
Correct.
You could do two things at that point, right? And this is this injection of mostly young 20-something millennial types.
Yeah.
The adults and the millennial and the people that they're courting here, these young people. You can do one of two things, right? One is you can say, he's been a disappointment. He's not up to par.
Yeah.
We're going to have to regroup and fight the battles again. Or you can just say that, the people are deplorable and they're terrible. And I don't remember that sort of sentiment in any large measure before 2010. It was always like if Clinton dropped or fell short, it wasn't because the country was terrible or it was racist or it was, irredeemable. It was just sort of like, that's the legislative process. You win some, you lose some. Yeah. And the move to executive orders, right? The presidents have always done executive orders. You can look it up. George Washington, first president.
Yep.
But Obama's willingness to use executive orders in the place of legislative policy, actual legislation, is significant. It's something that most intellectuals on the left still haven't come to grips with. So that's one. But
the famous line, of course, is I've got a pen
and a phone.
Yeah. And I've got a phone. Right. And so, that, and of course, there's nobody in the press that was going to talk against Obama, because he was largely doing things that they were probably sympathetic with. So there was and of course, if some sort of egghead nerd like you or me would be like, well, actually, that's not really the place of the president. The president is an executive, and legislation really needs to come from the legislative branch. It's like, we actually know enough civics and are familiar enough with civics to know that, there is a reason for the separation of powers, and that if you're frustrated legislatively, then there are real consequences to doing the pen and phone move.
Yes. Now, part of the reason why they moved to the pen and phone was because of the 2010 elections and just getting eviscerated across the board.
Yeah.
But when they did Obamacare, what's called the Affordable Care Act, in March of 2010, when they realized they couldn't go to a conference committee because Ted Kennedy, when he died, a Republican, ultimately ended up winning that seat in an earthquake in Massachusetts.
I forgot about that.
They couldn't do a conference. There's a motion to proceed in the Senate to actually appoint a conference committee on legislation.
Right.
And they couldn't. The Republicans were going to filibuster. Jim DeMint and other Republicans said, no, we're not going to give y'all, y'all were doing the same thing for us over the years. We're going to do the same to you. Yeah. And so ultimately they just took up, the House just took up. And if you remember Pelosi and the Democrats, they wanted in the rule to deem the bill passed as part of the rule, which is a way that the House brings up legislative. It's a procedural thing. Mm-hmm. And they were just going to deem the bill passed. Right. Which was an incredible perversion and a pollution and a destruction of the legislative process. To do a bill of that sort without a conference committee, I sometimes, Kale, I think our the partisans on the other side, the Democrats and the left, they tend to look at these events in isolated examples, right? Like the Judge Bork nomination, like we defeated Bork's nomination. Awesome. Let's move on.
Yeah.
And they don't really think about, okay, well, how did that affect these processes later, right?
Yeah, I totally agree with you. And it, it's so funny, Mark, because the character that haunts all of these visions of, to me, the corruption and the corrosion of legislative comity between the parties and between the different eras is Joe Biden. I mean, it's remarkable that this guy who is barely sentient at the podium, sadly enough, he's always there. Mark, I have, it's like, it's just amazing to me that this figure, he is this, I mean, look, he's been there for 50 years. I mean, I think 49 technically.
Yeah, since 1972.
And he has been part of this, this corrosive move, that we've seen play out in our lifetimes. And so it's these, and again, I can hear people saying, oh, well, y'all are talking about process and like it really matters. Like these things actually matter. And it's one thing to sort of to yammer on about, the Affordable Care Act, and that's fine. We can have that conversation, but it's not so much just what the Affordable Care Act did or didn't do. It's how the Affordable Care Act came into being. That has a long-term effect on how you interact with other people, how you draft legislation or not, how you kick the can down. It's amazing.
Big chunks of Obamacare were done with budget reconciliation.
Right.
So when you fast forward to Trump and the Republicans in 2017 and 2018 wanting to use reconciliation to undo it, they're basically just using a process that the Democrats had manipulated in a way that hadn't been used that way before because they wanted to get around the filibuster.
Right.
Well, it does. These things have long-term ramifications, and the legislative process is one of them. We don't really legislate anymore.
So the idea of legislative process, right? So this is where I kind of bring the story back to you, as sort of a longtime observer of the scene, as being part of the scene, and seeing all these things happen and being part of it. What effect does this have upon you in terms of the way you see the future of this constitutional republic, and why, and I have, why do you look at Donald Trump as in some way the sort of the answer to all of this corrosion that I've seen?
Yeah, well, I would certainly say it partly the answer.
I know.
I guess the issue is this, right? Like we could talk about how immigration policy that was bipartisan for the previous 20 years before Trump really hurt working class parts of the country, manufacturing, really hurt Black and Hispanic, working class areas of the country, how it was harmful for culture, all of those things. And there were voices on our side, on our ideological side, that said those things, Pat Buchanan being one, but there are many, many others. Right? We could talk about China and the threat to China, and I think China's integration in the last 20 years, the worst decision the country's political class and elites have probably ever made. And we're still not really dealing with that. And still,
no, we're not facing it. Clearly, we're clearly not facing it.
No, there were all these things that were there, but Trump did it. Right. I mean, like Rick Santorum could have done it, I suppose, but it was there for 16 other candidates in 2016, and they didn't do it. And that's worth something to me. It's almost like there's a great line in the movie Wall Street that I love so much with Gordon Gekko and Bud Fox, and when the line Gecko's talking about himself, but he says about a roast, he says it's not always the most popular guy that gets the job done, right? And I think sometimes there's a desire, certainly in the intellectual class and people of our graduate education and stuff, that the person conduct themselves. I kind of look at Winston Churchill as sort of a model, like, he did the right things, but he was also sort of intellectual in the way that I sort of would like to fancy myself. He read a lot, he reads a lot, he writes a lot. Right. And I think with Trump, being divorced twice and the Playboy in New York and all this stuff. At first I thought that was a disadvantage, but what's interesting about it is it turned into an advantage because he just was impervious to the criticism. he didn't, there were things that most conventional elected officials just would have buckled.
Yeah, well, and including people like me and you, right? I mean, if I,
yeah, oh,
I mean, just yeah, fair enough. Okay, keep going.
yeah,
Sorry.
So I think the fact that he did stand up. Now, in fairness to him, he was saying some of these things for many years. I just didn't pay attention, right?
Yeah.
He wasn't a Johnny come lately about China or immigration or trade or any of these things.
Yeah.
So he actually did it. And I do think it took him. I mean, look, here's where I'll have some criticisms of the president. And they're measured, I suppose. Yeah. I think he genuinely, and certainly his family genuinely thought there would be this period, honeymoon, whatever you'd want to call it, where people sort of come together and say, okay, you won the presidential election. There's some distance that you don't necessarily work and help the other guy, but you kind of give him. And I don't think he was mentally. And I think no one would have, I don't think, but I think he genuinely thought there would be some degree of civility, right? And there just was none.
Yeah.
And I think it took him I think he put a lot of stock into generals, right? Like the generals are, these big business guys, and these are accomplished people because in the way he grew up, they were, right? But they're not now.
Well, it took him
a couple of years to kind of. Again, he's got Russia pounding him every day. The media, the siege is just for people that aren't here and don't have the experience that I do. It really was unprecedented. But I would say by 2019,
the kind of heat and the pressure and the circus that surrounded it on cable news and okay.
And he almost every time he would tweet, it was in response to something.
Yeah.
It wasn't like he just sort of like, all right, I think I'm just going to pick on this guy today, right? I mean, there are times that sometimes I'm like, I know all presidents have probably said that, Mr. President, but they didn't tweet it. I think we would all have those moments. But I think there's something about his background and his skill set and his demeanor and his exterior. I'm not saying that he doesn't want people that are powerful and pretty and fancy to like him. Yeah. But I think at a certain point he realized it's those regular Joe evangelicals in Iowa, right? And it's those kinds of people that are really why I'm here. And
or to be fair, have you look? I mean, you look at these kind of demographic numbers, but did you see how Trump performed on the border of Texas?
Yes,
amongst Latinos,
huge numbers,
unbelievable. And again, that's a perfect example of the way that the narrative, the sort of the received narrative, just doesn't hold up. It doesn't hold up. So
highest raw number of Black voters Republicans ever gotten, and the highest percentage of Republican nominees gotten since the 1964 and 65 Civil Rights and Voting Rights Act.
Unreal. I mean, it's unreal. Yeah. All right. So so he's not there now, right? I mean, so we're in the midst of the Biden presidency, and I'm sure all of our viewers and listeners know that Afghanistan, that humiliating debacle has the part one or act one of that ended yesterday when the last troop left the airstrip. And so, look, we're going to be dealing with that for decades to come, in my opinion. But anyway, I don't want to bog us down into a discussion about Afghanistan. But so again, as a long time Hill guy, you've worked in the halls of government for so long. And you, of all people, look at what is going on, and just based upon our conversations that we have offline and on, texting back and forth, you look at Washington, it's broken. I mean, you just, right? Am I putting words in your mouth?
Yes. No. I think the question for you and I, and we've talked about this with the Catholic Church hierarchy, with the NFL, with all sorts of
academia, right? Hollywood, the media establishment.
Few things have transpired that have surprised me about how corrupt things are as such.
Sure.
I mean, but I would say there was a galvanizing moment. I think one of the special things about President Trump is his ability to bring this out, right? Like to put sunshine on the corruption. And that is in March of 2017. So we got to remember, I went from the transition. I was asked to work at the Labor Department. I was the director of budget and finance there. We have no secretary until May. So I'm just kind of on cruise control. And the president tweeted a few things that have really been in like red pill. I mean, I took a red pill in 2005 with Hurricane Katrina, I think, although I've always been conservative. But the red pill moment for me working for the president was when he tweeted, this is about March of 2017, that the Obama administration had illegally manipulated FISA and gotten illegal warrants to illegally spy on multiple members of the campaign, that they'd illegally wiretapped the Trump transition, and that they were using people in senior Justice Department law enforcement agencies to use the 25th Amendment to remove a duly elected member of president from the presidency. Well, you know, I mean, I just said there's no way. There is, this is not,
it can't be, right? I mean, you know, and you're like, Trump, like, what the hell are you doing?
Yes, but that was the last time. After, as the weeks turned into months, and it turned out that he's absolutely right about all the spying on his campaign, all the spying on the transition, and Rod Rosenstein and the rumors about that and the 25th Amendment and guys wearing a wire was all true. At a certain point in the fall of 2017, I just decided, when I decided to stay, right? Because I wasn't sure if I was going to go back to, but when my family made a decision for me, I said, you know, I'm not going to discount anything that the president says or tweets. It doesn't mean that I'm going to immediately accept it, right? But I'm just not going to discount it, because think about that. The Obama administration has now just destroyed the transition of power. Yes,
and again, Mark,
we talk about January 6th. We talk about January 6th and Trump and Biden. It's already destroyed.
Yeah.
You know, like,
no, and I think that's part of that. That's why I think you have to draw the aperture much wider. You know, it's irresponsible to sort of I mean, look, I mean, even like you just brought this up, I hadn't thought of that in years, and I've just sort of, oh yeah, by the way, you know, all this awful things actually happened, you know, and it's just the shrug, but he's like our guy, so like how mad can I get because I don't like Trump either? And he's like, well, wait, no, that's not how this works.
I mean, Richard Nixon had some aides talk to the Internal Revenue Service to look into political opponents. Okay. I mean, we're talking, the Obama administration destroyed the transition of power. So I don't want, when I hear people talking about how the president was using whatever legal options were afforded to him in the aftermath of the 2020 election, that this was somehow damaging to, you know, the institutions of the country. First of all, I had to like almost laugh out, spit my morning tea out to think that these people were defending the actions of the previous administration, but also that's what they're there for, right? Like, there's a reason why the Congress, for example, traditionally certifies the electoral college votes. Now, typically it's just a perfunctory thing until the last 20 years, where the Democrats would object every time a Republican won. Right. But the reason why it's there is the framers thought, well, in the unlikely event that there's some dispute here, it'll give the Congress a sort of the final backstop and they can look at it. Right.
Yeah, of course.
So that's what they're, but the Obama administration destroyed the transition of power. They weaponized defense and law enforcement agencies against a duly elected president. They conjured up this ridiculous scenario that had a Russia investigation that spent $60 million with 50 and 60 attorneys that are all like the guys that we grew up with back home, who were the best lawyer people we could ever think of, who are fierce Democrat partisans. And they found nothing. Well, so like at a certain point, you know, there's no German banks. There's none of that. It's all false.
You know? Well, you know, and that's,
but Biden's is all true. But Biden's family is all true.
No, it's an incredible, you know, it's the iron law of projection. You know, it's like the very things that they, you know, filled up cable news with the accusations on CNN and MSNBC, et cetera, you know, that was exactly the same things that they themselves had already employed and will continue. All right. So look, we're up here against the hour. And I wanted to ask you sort of as a sort of a, you know, how do you see this thing playing out? I mean, you know, beyond, you know, necessarily Trump, we can get into 2024. Maybe I'll bring you back for a 2024 show. But I mean, look, you know, the brokenness of DC hasn't magically mended with the emergence of old Joe here. And what do you think is going to happen here with Biden? He's not with his faculties. I mean, honestly, what do you think?
Well, what's interesting about the president is a big reason why the Democrats can't ask him or politely or unpolitely ask him to stand aside is because they need Kamala Harris to be the vice president to have the 51st vote in the Senate to do budget reconciliation. Now,
wait, are you meaning to tell me that it's that cynical, Mark?
Oh, I guarantee it. Well, I'm telling you, if the Democrats had already done this $3.5 trillion budget reconciliation, look, they would probably ask him to go aside. Look, I would say that the president could have a stroke on live TV today, and we see him crumple to the floor, and they would figure out a way to hold him on until they do. Because what you got to remember about the reconciliation, the vice president, the presidency is if the president either has to step down or is removed and Kamala Harris becomes the president, the Congress has to vote to replace the vice president, right? So
the Congress votes on that.
Yes, the House votes on it and the Senate votes on it. We were like, all right, well, the Democrats have 50 senators, the Republicans have 50 senators. There's no way Mitch McConnell and Republican senators are going to allow the Democrats to have a 51st vote to do all the things that they want to do, including reconciliation. So I'm telling you that's but they're going to do reconciliation. Bank on it. If there's one thing you can count on, the Republicans cut taxes in Washington, Democrats spend money.
Yeah.
They're going to do
Republicans are pretty good at spending money, too. So anyway, but go ahead.
Yes,
I digress. I know what you mean. I take your point. I take your point.
I can assure you less. But they're going to do all that. Then after that, I don't know. I think they're setting things up for inflation of the sort that we kind of experienced as young kids.
It's coming back.
I think that look, if I had to, here's what I'll project. The Democrats will lose bigly in the House of Representatives. They'll lose 30 seats. They'll lose every seat that voted for Trump, plus any seat that's within probably 5 points of voting for Trump, which is about 30. They'll lose most of those. Right. They'll probably net lose about 3 senators because
both are going to flip in 2022.
Yes. Okay. Yes. And there's no doubt in my mind that President Trump's going to run for the Republican nomination again. I think if the elections in 2020 in these states were free, fair, and transparent, I think he would have said, I lost fair and square. Yeah. I'll continue to have a big role in the party and I want the issues that I've changed the party on to continue. But I think as long as his health is the way it is, now the guy lives like he's 40 years old. The people that I know that are around him that are 30 years old can't keep up with him. So he doesn't have any health issues. I think he will run for the nomination. No significant Republican, no DeSantis. Ron DeSantis owes his career to Trump in 2018. He'll never run against Trump in a primary. Yeah. And then we'll see what happens. People think, there's no way Trump could win. Look, if you get a variant of 70 style, a Delta variant 70 style inflation, I don't think people understand who are under really our age and younger don't really know what inflation's like.
Yeah, no, I agree.
And if I had to predict, I would predict today that on January 20th, 2025, the president will return for a second term. He'll have decent numbers in the House and Senate, and the Democrats, by using manipulating the reconciliation process the way they have, are setting things up for the Republicans to be in a position to do things that they wouldn't have been able to do in Trump's first term.
Interesting.
And the thing that you got to remember is go back to Obama's first term and then look at his second term. Clinton first and second.
Yeah, of course.
Typically, it takes a while. It's not like a prime ministerial system or parliamentary system. Yeah. It takes time to get your people to get acclimated, to get going. I think the president will do executive orders of the kind that I wish he would have done in his first term, that I think he would have already been doing in his second term if they've been consecutive. But that's my prediction today. We'll see if I have to eat those words, but
you heard it here first, people.
Prognostication is a dangerous thing.
Yeah, indeed. All right. Well, man, I wanted to talk with you about religious liberty questions and some of the cultural issues that you and I'd
love to
talk about all the time. But I got to draw us to a close here. Mark, this has been great. I mean, this has been fun. We haven't ever done this before. So you get 2 Zeldens this time, people.
We're like the Weinstein brothers,
That's right. That's right. The Catholic Jews. Folks, if you could like and subscribe this podcast, we'd appreciate it. You can leave feedback. You can razz on Mark. You can find me on Twitter, Kale Zelden, at twitter.com, and all that sort of stuff. So until then, don't get nothing on you. Be good.